Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm offering an introduction to object-oriented programming with Python set in Google Colab, which is a great tool for working with Python. Stay tuned. Alright, so the first thing that we see is that I'm inside of Google Colab. And this is an online Python environment where you can combine text and code. And the first thing up front here is the outline, where I just talk a little bit about what is in this document. So there's an explanation of some of the theory and then some opportunities for practice. As far as the background, I wanted to talk a little bit about procedural programming first because it's probably what many or most of you use on a regular basis, and it may be where you're more familiar. So the idea here is that I wanted to prompt the user for an item, then the quantity of that item, and then a unit price for that item. So here in my function that I started, I have a section for collecting user inputs, and you can see that the item is just a text entry, then the quantity takes an integer, and then the unit price takes a float, so you can use decimals in there. And then the next thing here is a little equation where I calculate the total using the unit price times the quantity. And then the output is a simple statement that says you bought however many of whatever item for a total price. And then the function is called to run everything. So if you were to run this cell, you can see, let's say we bought oranges and we bought 10 oranges and they were 33 cents a piece. Now, I don't have it set up to do rounding. That's something you could implement. But here, you bought 10 oranges for a total of roughly $3.3. So the next section is all about object-oriented programming. And in contrast with procedural programming, the object-oriented programming paradigm relies on the construction and interaction of entities called objects. So that's why it has the name object-oriented. And this makes everything really more reusable. And so I thought an example here could be forest biodiversity. This is just to get you to think about how it might work. So imagine that in your code you have a class called plant, and that would have inputs. So this particular class, a plant, would need things like sunlight, water, carbon dioxide, and the output would be oxygen and sugar. So you can think of it kind of like a black box where it has some inputs and some outputs. And that may remind you of a function, and you'll see more about that. Another shared characteristic that could be defined in this class is the plant's preferred light environment, such as full shade, partial sun, or full sun. And all of these characteristics are called attributes. So imagine that we have that class, which is sort of a very general definition of a plant. But what if you have a very specific instance of that, like an oak tree or a jasmine flowering shrub or something like that? You can imagine that those are all a little bit different. And so here I present the example of oak trees and ferns. Now, while they have some shared characteristics like their inputs and outputs, they have some very different properties as well. So the lighting requirement for them would be very different. And so just thinking about this from a graphical perspective here, we can see this diagram shows that the class plant has several inputs and outputs, and then the instance of that class, one of them is called oak, would have different values for each of those attributes. So it might need full sun, while the fern might need very low levels of sun. Another example of this is video game characters, and the concept of instances being derived from classes is quite powerful. So the example that I give here is that you might have a class like an enemy, and individual instances of that enemy class, they would have shared characteristics like the health level of the enemy or the damage level. So you might have 10 of the same type of enemy, and so they're all roughly the same when they are initiated. But you could also have a boss enemy, and while it would also have its own health and damage level, those values would be quite different and much higher than the normal enemies in the game. So this idea of object-oriented programming is powerful when you have a class or like a style of an object, and then you have many different instances of that particular object. So how do we do this in Python? So to create a class in Python, you type the word class followed by the class name, which is capitalized, and then you follow that up with the colon character. So here we can see the example of that, and we're just going to continue with that gaming example. And so our class is enemy, and then don't forget we have a little colon after that. And below that, you need to add an initialization function, which is called a method because it's a function inside of the class. And then this takes the class attributes as arguments, or those little options inside of the parentheses. So here we have def to start our function. We have the double underscore or dunder init, and then inside of the parentheses we have self, health, and damage. And it's important to include the self attribute as one of the arguments. But the two that we add on here that may look very familiar is just health and damage. So depending on whatever class you're setting up, these will change. But for our generic enemy class, we want to make sure that each enemy has some health and some damage. Now inside of that init method, we can define the custom attributes. So we need to set those up as self.health and set that equal to our health argument, and then self.damage and set it up the same way. Then set up a second function called createVillain to create an enemy instance. And this one in particular, we have our createVillain function here, and then villain equals enemy 80, 6. So this is actually using our class called enemy to create an instance of an enemy called a villain. And we're giving it these particular values of 80 and 6. So you could have another instance with much different values. That could be like a boss or something. Now we create a main function where the createVillain function is called, and we can include what I'm calling an ominous output statement, warning the player that a villain has appeared with certain health and damage levels. So here's the code again. We have our enemy class, we have our function to create the villain, and then we have our main function, and inside of that we actually create the villain and then print the statement about what happens. So we can see this code in action below. You can feel free to modify this, but this is the actual cell where it runs. We can just click the play button here, and it says, watch out, a villain with 80 health and 6 damage has appeared. Now for a code challenge, think about this yourself, and I encourage you to look at this before you look at the answer, which is provided below. So you can pause and work on this before you scroll down further. But the idea here is that you would take that idea of the grocery example previously presented and then fill it out and work on it yourself. So as a quick walkthrough, we have our class groceries, we have our init function set up, and then we have some special variables here for item, quantity, and total. Then we have our function get groceries, and then we set those values for all the variables that we created, and then we return groceries. And then we have our main function, which calls that get groceries function and then prints out all of the information that we needed. And then again, our final included statement about the main. And if we run that, we should get the same thing that we saw earlier in the procedural example. It's a little bit more complex, but it does the same thing. And in general, this is a more extensible example of the same type of thing. So let's go ahead and do this again. Oranges, so we had 10 of those. And this time, let's just make the price 50 cents a piece. And it says you bought 10 oranges for a total of $5. So that's all for this one. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share the video, and check out some of my other content, which I talk about a lot of principles of data science, some in the weeds statistics and probability stuff, and also some visual design things for educators. So I hope you have a great week. Take care, and I'll see you next time.